So there are very few subjects that are so shrouded in fear and mystery as death, or the death process. And after my own NDE experience, I think it should come as no surprise that this is a subject very close to my heart. I see it as part of my mission to share a new perspective on this process, and I am very well aware that in that process I am going to share some ideas and new concepts that are possibly controversial, but please bear with me. It comes from a good place, and I think it's very important that this information gets out there so we can take away some of the fear. To begin with, we need to establish that we cannot talk about death without talking about consciousness, for these two concepts are intrinsically linked. You must understand, first of all, that you are not your body. You are pure consciousness, the essence that is you. There seems to be a popular assumption that consciousness somehow has something to do with the body. This is not true. Consciousness is everywhere. Consciousness doesn't need a body to exist. It just is. And so we exist within the field of consciousness. There is also a belief that the soul, or that consciousness, resides within the brain. And so if the brain dies, consciousness dies. But when we die, it doesn't affect our consciousness. When we die, the body dies. The physical vessel just ceases to exist, to be alive. Truly, the death process is nothing more than a shift in consciousness from one state to another, from the physical to the non-physical. Many people within the New Age community and in the spiritual community, they often use the analogy of virtual reality, or I myself like to use the analogy of a video game. So in my talks, I use that as a way to explain it. When you enter a video game, you have your console, your Xbox, whatever. You enter, you begin a game, and you are a character. You choose a character. And let's say this character is a warrior. Now, you, who is behind the motherboard, is controlling the character, is the consciousness that animates the character in the video game, the warrior in this particular instance. The warrior is you in the body. So now this warrior has a certain trajectory, it has a few adventures, and then at some point it dies. The avatar dies. Within that transition of dying, you become aware of the video game, because in this transition, you understand, there is a realization that you were this character, that you were in this game. But your consciousness didn't die, because your consciousness is infinite. What is the beauty of this process is that we realize that we get taken from this very small, single mind perspective to the infinite perspective. And in that process, in that transitional process, we get to be shown what lies behind the game, the video game. So that's very important. It's a bottleneck, really. So the consciousness animates our body, which is the bottle. And then upon death, the soul leaves the body. It gets squeezed through the top of the head. It usually leaves through the crown of the head. So it gets squeezed through this tiny portal, and there it just re-emerges into the wider infinite consciousness. The death process, the transitional process, mostly includes the experience of going into a tunnel with a bright light at the end of the tunnel, but it always includes a bright light. There is a morphing with the light, and within this light, within the experience of becoming one with this light, this cosmic light, there is usually a being greeted by loved ones, by passed over loved ones, or being greeted by spirit guides or any kind of energetic entities that are connected to us, depending on the stage of our spiritual evolution. And these reunions and reconnections are always very loving. They produce deep feelings of oneness, of belonging, of coming home, and deep bliss, very blissful. So if someone is well prepared and sure of what's going to happen, this transitional phase is going to go very smoothly. There is minimal resistance. Instead, there is a surrender, a release, and a joyful re-emergence. In the case where there is a lot of fear involved, this process is understandably going to be very different. So depending on your beliefs, your attachments, you're either going to have a smooth or a lesser smooth transition. Religious beliefs, religious dogmas, beliefs in heaven and hell, the big annihilation, the big ending or the big black, etc. All of these are ultimately going to play an important part in your experience. Now, there is one part, a particular aspect in the death transition, and that has to do with the silver cord. So people that do astral traveling or have an out-of-body experience, an OBE, have many times recorded this phenomena of the silver cord, an energetic cord that connects the soul with the body. And in the death process, in the transitional phase that is death, we relinquish that silver cord. What we see in past life regressions in general is that the death transition is usually very peaceful. However, in cases where people died traumatic death, they can arrive in the afterlife very confused. For instance, soldiers on a battlefield, their death happens usually very quickly, and their souls are in a state of total shock and disbelief after they have transitioned the body, because they didn't realize that they have died already. They basically didn't realize what happened to them because it happened so quickly. And they arrive in a state of anxiety. And then these souls are going to need more time to transition properly. And they're going to need more time to integrate the whole experience. So they're going to need some kind of guidance. What follows then is various forms of life review, all relative to your current level of awakening or consciousness. And when that process is fully finished, the soul gets to spend a certain amount of time in the in-between life sphere, contemplating the next incarnation. And that is the level, that is the dimension where we get to discuss the concepts of soul contracts. Every soul gets to co-create, to a certain degree, what kind of blueprint his next physical existence will have. So every soul gets to decide on his next soul adventure. Basically, it's another video game. You re-enter the game. So your soul contract usually includes the choice of your parents, the place, the country you're going to be born in, the key players in your life, and a certain amount of key experiences. Because every incarnation is an opportunity to learn certain life lessons. And once these lives are over, when we transition again, we bring the experience and all the lessons learned from this particular experience, from this particular life, we bring it back to the wider consciousness, to the higher self, or to our God self, whatever name you want to give it. Now, the way this existence turns out, of course, how well you play out your soul contract, of course, is depending on a lot of things. It depends on where we are in our soul's evolution and our level of consciousness. A lot of this information has been taken directly from my own personal experience, from my NDE and my afterlife experience, but most of it has come from the many regressions that have been done throughout the world since the 1970s, largely, like my teacher, who has been doing this for over 40 years. And a lot of data has been compiled from people that had near-death experiences, from the past life regressions. And important is to realize that on one hand, science is inching ever closer to quantify this, to explain it. But they still haven't really gotten to a consensus about these supernatural phenomena, etc. But just because they haven't doesn't mean that we should disregard the outcome of all this data, all the information from all these experiences, so you can sustain the belief that they simply are not true or that it doesn't exist. In certain indigenous tribes, and in shamanism and in Buddhism, for instance, there is a practice in place in which you get to prepare for death in the best way possible. So one could almost say that all of this life, this movie, should be used and dedicated to the best possible transition, that is the moment of death. At the same token, this also shows how far removed we are as a society from death, and from the notion that is death, and how misunderstood consciousness is. Let me add that this three-step process, this three-step afterlife protocol that I just explained, is quite basic. There's obviously a lot more to it, because we are all individual, we are all unique, and we are all on our individual journey. But there is a basic outline of what happens in the death process, and I thought it was important to share it in this way. But it is a basic protocol nevertheless. I believe that mankind has been indoctrinated by many falsehoods, and that death is one of them. So it's very important that these new concepts, these new beliefs, get out there into the world. I am by far the only one talking about these new concepts. I'm merely adding to the pool of all this new alternative information coming out here into the world. The main purpose of this is that there is an awakening, there is a global awakening happening. And so by helping people to understand these concepts, by inviting them to embrace them, we can help them to start their own awakening. And this is very, very important. And one of the main things for this awakening is to lose fear. We need to transcend fear, because fear is what keeps us in the enslavement of 3D. And I talk about this spiritual awakening in my next video, where I will talk more elaborately about my own awakening and what is basically going on a global level.